Hi, if you're actually at the crossroads, we will be having an event for horror and architecture with the authors Joshua Comaroff and Ong Ker-Shing. If you're actually interested with the title, I'm sure it intrigues you. And if you wish to find out more about what they're actually talking about in their book, be sure to join us right now. And without further ado, I'll just hand over the mic to the authors and they will actually speak more about the book. Thank you.
Hi. Didn't work at all. Hi. I hope, is this too loud? Too soft? No? Hi, so I'm Ong Ker-Shing and that's Josh Comaroff, and we're here to talk about our first book, Horror in Architecture. We don't have very much time today, so what we'd like to do is just give you a little intro to the book, maybe tell you a little bit more so that you understand the title, why horror in architecture. A lot of people, my mom included, looks at this title and says, why would you want to write a book about horrible architecture? And I think that's one of the things we want to try and convey to you today. It's not a negative book. In fact, we think horror is an incredible genre, full of imaginative things, full of innovation. And so let me just dive straight into this presentation that we've prepared. So hello. We are Josh and Shing, and we wrote this book called Horror in Architecture. And we wrote this book because we like horror films and we like architecture. And because we feel that the one can be used to talk about the other. Now, we're architects, so we talk about buildings a lot. But the more we talked with each other about buildings, and even more when we tried to explain them to our clients, to our parents and our students, the harder we found it. Buildings seem simple, but they're actually very hard to talk about. Then we noticed something. I wish we had some music, So when we compare buildings to other things, their forms become much easier to describe. We suddenly found that we could talk about buildings to people who are not trained to understand jargon, design jargon. And at the same time, we noticed that a lot of modern buildings, in the way that they express themselves, they resemble other kinds of things. So for example, what do you see when you see these buildings? Okay, we have to try and erase history and everything. Just what do you see when you just look at the form of these buildings? We see this. And this is the Winklevoss twins, played by the same guy, Armie Hammer. So it's two in the Facebook movie, but these are the twins, okay? Or this is the MVRDB Pavilion in the Hanover Expo.
So we see this.
So we'll talk more about this later. Now, in particular, monsters are really good for talking about buildings that are unconventional or unusual. They can be giant, tiny, blobby, or they could be made up of lots of unmatched pieces. They can pretend to be something that they're not. They can be hiding something inside that you didn't expect. And they could even be partially dead. And let me just break here for a minute. This presentation is packed full of images, but don't worry, we've removed all the really scary ones.
So you don't have to hide your
you don't have to hide your kids. Creatures and characters from horror films are unique because they break conventions. And I think a lot of people, you can really notice that because most of them are conventions. The convention is the human body as we know it, right? So it's very easy for you to spot when they break conventions. Now we started to notice that certain buildings break conventions in very similar ways. So we started to use horror films in particular as a way of talking about the buildings that we found most exciting. It became a way of talking about architecture that breaks conventions. And now we'd like to show you how we make these kinds of comparisons. So is that building a monster? And you guys probably ask yourselves that a lot. There are many different types within horror media. Okay? For example, doubles and clones, psychos, zombies, ghosts, the exquisite corpse, vampires, and of course human-animal hybrids. And this is just a few. So now let's look at a few.
So we'll start with a very basic category of horror, which is doubles and clones. I'm sure many of you have seen films in which, especially films, the classics from the 1950s and 60s, where there are clones, doubles, twins, substitutes. And the double is too close for comfort. That's the special thing about the double. That's why we're uncomfortable. For example, if you look at this image of a typical semi-detached house, and then one of the classic sort of mock horror films, Sam Raimi's Army of Darkness, we'll describe in a little bit how these two things are related to each other. But we ask ourselves the question, is it one person or is it two? Are twins, like we saw before, the same person, or are they different people? Historically, twins have actually often been thought of across many cultures as a bad omen. They seem to break the natural order in which people are allowed to be individuals. But strangely, twins are one of the most popular and common forms of modern architecture, especially recently today with the development of these kind of specialty spectacular towers, like the World Trade Center in Bahrain. You see the Highlight Tower, or even closer to home here, the Echelon Square in Colombo or Sri Lanka. And twins appear even more remarkable when they're joined, with the famous Siamese twins. For example, in the semi-detached house. So both of the images you see here are actually two houses. They have the characteristics of two houses, but they're also joined together into one. These are in England. So is it one house or two? What you see on the lower right-hand side is actually a diagram of Chang and Eng, the famous Siamese twins, and where they were connected at their midsection. On the upper right is a plan showing a kind of a similar relationship between two semi-detached houses in Yorkshire. So twins become more interesting when the two twins still joined grow to become very different from each other.
And so we look here at a set of semi-detached houses that we actually drive by every day. It's close to our home. This is at 3638 Jalan Haji Alias. Now, what you can see here is these semi-detached houses were originally developed as one. You know, they share the same height, the same number of floors. The floor plates are at the same level. They actually have the same massing. And yet, you see over time how one became very different from the other because of the way that the owner decided to develop it. Now, what we see in the red dotted line is the party wall, the point of mirror between the two houses. The one on the left is extroverted, you could say, while the one on the right is shy. It has more windows, right? The one on the left is more colorful, whereas the one on the right is now dull. The one on the left is a lot more ornamented. There are a lot of stone feature walls, whereas the one on the right is plain. It even goes so far to the street side where there are plants on the left but none on the right. So what's interesting here is when you see how twins can alter over time, twins in architecture can alter over time such that one becomes really quite distinct from the other. And this is actually a technique that we'll see later on in some of these other architectural examples. But it asks the question, at what point does this become two? At what point do twins no longer remain as one item, one entity? So you see here this visual effect of twins has been amplified by some architects deliberately to explore the gray line between one thing and many things. So this is a famous tower, the Siamese Tower by Alejandro Aravena in Santiago. And you see at the base, it's figured as one tower, which later on starts to sort of crane and tear apart to become two at the top.
And it's actually a kind of interesting formal analog of the building, because the building is a science faculty which have separate, distinct and private research labs. So what they did is they combined the shared resources at the base, and as the building grows up toward the spaces that are private, not shared, it actually starts to split more into two entities, two completely different individuals.
You also see this in this Inner Mongolia house by Johnston Mark Lee. This is in Ordos. It's a very interesting brief for this house, which is for a single family house of 10,000 square feet in China. And of course, Johnston Mark Lee were asking, is this perhaps too large to become a house? I mean, it's certainly too large to house a single family, let alone a single family with usually just one child. Yeah. So here they deliberately created a building that was one and two at the same time. The roof expresses it as two houses, whereas at the base it is one.
And interestingly, when you look at it from the street front, from the arrival, it presents more of a unified front, like a single building. As you move around to the private spaces, much more like two. So they really play back and forth between those readings of the house as one and the house as a double.
And of course, we often have many, many more than two. So what happens then, when we're living in a world of clones?
Those are all Robbie Williams. It's artist Paul M. Smith in the Saatchi Gallery.
Clones are really an integral part of our buildings and our cities. We see them every day. They are powerful, repetition is a powerful presence in our daily lives. Rows and rows where all the houses are the same. This is true in horizontal versions where many units are placed next to each other in grids, such as this workers' housing by Walter Gropius, or vertically, closer to home. Again, architects have deliberately used this condition to explore the repetitive possibilities of modern building. So here, Eisenman, in his proposal for this research institute in Carnegie, for this building in the Carnegie Mellon Research Institute, you see here variations of the same form, but then each one sort of changes a little bit, almost like sort of mutations.
And it was supposed to represent sort of like genetic individuals in a common line of DNA. So they develop stage to stage to stage in a different sort of like generations in a family.
So repetition is interesting. It makes us ask, does repetition always mean sameness? Sometimes it provides a background against which you can see surprises and exceptions. So this is housing, the Lindsay Road housing in the UK by SAT. And what's nice here is that they use this graphical motif that carries over through the entire development, but it allows for the articulation of special moments, like here, the corner, the entrance to the housing estate.
So if we talk about a slightly different tradition of horror, one is the Exquisite corpse. And this is probably a figure that most would associate directly with Frankenstein. It's the most famous exquisite corpse, probably the most famous exquisite corpse example in the world, right? It's sort of the icon of a single being that's put together with a lot of mismatched parts. So it's basically a collection of parts that don't match. And the term exquisite corpse comes from surrealist art. It's a very famous game, actually a parlor game, where they got groups of very interesting artists together, folded up a piece of paper. I think many have actually played this at home or in school, right? Where you write as part of a sentence, or you draw a piece of a picture, and then you fold it, and the next person does the next one without seeing what you've done. And so when you unfold it, what you get is a very, very surprising composition, because nobody knew what anyone else was going to do, right? So it could be anything, and it's probably the work of many minds coming together. So like in this case, each section was drawn by a different artist. The top was Tanguy, then was Man Ray, Maurice, and then Juan Miro. And so what we got in the end was something that you can tell is sort of like one body, but is very surprising in every single one of its segments, different from what you'd expect. And the results were supposed to express famously a kind of new, disjointed modern experience, especially an urban experience. So the more polished type of exquisite corpse is what you see on the right. Again, several parties. This was using a collage method. Was Breton, Tanguy again, and Jacqueline Lamba. And then famously, Haussmann's mechanical head, which you see in the upper left. This was supposed to kind of represent the modern person who is as much a machine as they are a person, and as much as a machine as a human being. And so, this has actually been done before. If you look at these, are actually really cool. These are action figures for Hieronymus Bosch that were made in California a few years ago. But these actually represent much, much, much earlier artistic experiments in the same kind of formal idea. But the exquisite corpse is really a classic way of making monsters and horrible things. You can see they make a lot of kind of bodies where the parts don't seem to all go together, or they scare us with surprising elements. On the left was a kind of an anti-angel, a sort of a phoenix child, devilish kind of satanic spirit, and on the right something more like the kind of pulp Japanese monster film that we're familiar with. But most famously recently was John Carpenter's The Thing, where this creature kind of develops lots of different parts from different animals. So on the right it's more like a hybrid between a human and a plant, and on the left it's sort of like a dog. But you know, in the movie, these are just the action figures. We didn't show the pictures from the movie because they're really disgusting. But in the Exquisite Corpse, consistency is not important. The point is that the parts don't have to match. And so the most unexpected things can be brought together. And we still see this as very kind of rich approach to contemporary art, especially installation art. And one of our favorite artists who actually was working with us a bit on this book was Chris Cooksey, who combines architectural objects with other kinds of objects together. So on the right, actually at the Burning Man Festival, he created this church tank, which has tank treads on the base and a cannon and then a church on the top. He's done this with a lot of different kinds of things. Some are animals, some are machines. A lot of them are buildings. And on the left, we actually don't know the artist for this. He's an architectural kind of montage, putting together different elements of Asian architecture together into a kind of very, very strange natural architectural hybrid. But for buildings, what this means is endless possibilities, right? So going back to our Hardee's breakfast sandwich, each floor can be a totally independent world, and it doesn't have to depend on what's above or what's below. So in the Netherlands Pavilion, again, every single level was supposed to represent a different element of Dutch architecture or landscape, and they didn't have to have any relationship apart from the sides stairs that are joining as they curl and curve around the building. So the building, in effect, just becomes a stack and an exquisite corpse. So using the same logic, this is MVRDV's Silodam housing in Amsterdam, where every single flat in the entire block of flats is given a completely different facade, a different interior, a different reading on the outside of the building. And the block is just really a conglomeration of those elements being whatever they are. And there are a lot of variations in how this could be done. Many of you would know Andreas Gursky, the photographer, who he takes photos, but he also manipulates them digitally. In the upper left, there were a series of photos that he took in compounded buildings, and then he brought them very, very close together to kind of show how different the architecture could be from one building to the next, but also to show their proximity. The upper right was the famous Rem Koolhaas and OMA's Parc de la Villette competition entry. And it was one of the first landscapes where every single area was different materials, different bands, different programs, different activities, different features. The idea was that all of these would come together to build a kind of a Frankenstein landscape, but one that would provide lots and lots of different exciting possibilities for people. And in the bottom right, one of the most famous early versions of this was the Leaf House by Venturi Scott Brown, which was bringing a lot of different kinds of elements, but trying to unify them into one house. So the principle is always the same. Basically, everything's different. Every single piece is different. It has a different architectural expression. This one is by Frank Gehry, where he's again using the very, very big house as an opportunity to put a lot of really, really diverse small houses together and try and keep it interesting. This is him again at the Norton House, the lower left, in Santa Monica, and on the right is the Tel Aviv waterfront. So what you really see here are architects who are enjoying the possibilities of just combining things together, not really concerned about what those units themselves are. And so this can also be scary and dreamlike. I'm not sure if anyone's seen this. This is a Brazilian artist named Henrique Oliveira, and he basically takes existing buildings and adds this very strange layer of thin wood and plaster, which is like architecture, but it's become very organic. It's almost like parts of a body or bulges. And so he lets this invade the buildings that are actually about to be demolished, making way for new development. So you see a little bit of it there. That's the street view. So this is an actual building. It's in Brazil. That's the ground level. So it's sort of full of all of these things which still look like architecture and are still merged with architecture, but in a sense are quite different. And then often this exquisite corpse just happens by accident. It just happens out of necessity. So for example, here in Colombia, there's a church which needed to be built in a valley which had no flat ground. So what they did is they simply built a large aqueduct across the valley, and part of that aqueduct was this cathedral, which was built on the top. But the end result is incredibly surprising. So this is the Nuestra Sonora de los Ajas. It's in Ipiales, which is a very hilly kind of hill country town. So you look at it and you wonder, is it a church or is it a bridge? It's very ambiguous. We don't know whether it's one or the other. And the interesting thing about the exquisite corpse is that it makes you think about whether a building actually needs to be a single coherent object, whether it needs to be one thing or whether it can be many. And in fact, that's why it's interesting. Okay, so we talk a little bit about psychos. As we're going through the tour of horror, that's obviously Anthony Perkins. So the thing about psychos is that they look normal on the outside, but they aren't. They're obviously deeply not normal on the inside. And so inside kind of lurks somebody else, somebody who's dangerous. And the interior doesn't agree with outside appearances. So like in Psycho, it's actually Norman Bates' mother, who seems like, at least from in the window, a very nice, normal old lady, but then will attack you, in the shower. So the outside is kind of a mask. It's something that is formal and it's recognizable. We know what it looks like. But in fact, the inside is something completely different, completely surprising. It could be a machine, like in the case of the famous sci-fi cowboy movie Westworld, which is in the lower right-hand corner, where the sheriff actually turns out to have been a robot. The entire town is a simulation. But we see a lot of these kind of fantasies in science fiction and horror films where the face or the mask is removed and inside is something that's completely alien, completely different. And an architectural equivalent is famously used the Trojan horse, right? It's a gift. It's supposed to be something that is benign and triumphant, but inside is this kind of malevolent intent. There are all these soldiers there that are waiting to kind of break out and make war. So the inside of the Trojan horse, the inside and the outside can basically be completely different things. And especially in my home country, in kind of tacky American novelty architecture, we see a lot of this sort of thing, like in this shoe house, which actually exists. It's still there. It's kind of a roadside attraction in America, in Pennsylvania, and people live in it. Apart from the lower left, which I think is either a gift shop or an ice cream shop. I can't remember which one. Or this elephant observation deck in Coney Island, which is basically just a staircase which allows you to stand on the top, but was one of the kind of main fairground attractions at Coney Island for a long time. So the interior can be anything, no matter how weird. This was a famous kind of groovy 1960s interior lounge space that Werner Pantone, who many know as the inventor of Pantone, the Pantone color system, who was also a furniture designer and an interior designer, and designed a lot of kind of weird yellow submarine-ish kind of sexy 60s landscapes and 70s landscapes inside buildings.
Yeah, so this is the sort of like lounge room in their house, right?
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things here is just how the interior can be completely divorced from its exterior. How the interior is sort of allowed to be this completely imaginative world where you can leave everything outside.
Yeah, the outside was this very uptight Swiss country house, which just looked like it would have very kind of not groovy, not cool 60s people kind of or the inside could be creepy. This is another part of his apartment interior in Binningham, which had a kind of crystalline cave in the ceiling.
So this disjunct between the inside and the outside is something that is very common in the case of architectures where the interior has to be different. Like in this, what you see here is some grand theaters and opera houses in Europe. In the top is Garnier's Opera House, Paris Opera House. And what you see, maybe a bit hard to tell, but the interior volumes, the kind of spaces you expect in an opera house, the domes and the vaulted ceilings, they're not actually expressed on the outside. You would never know that they were there when you're looking at the building from the outside. Instead, the outside speaks more to where it is in the city, and the size, its proportions have to do with being a grand public space.
Kind of neoclassical shed.
Yeah, a neoclassical shed. And so you get a lot of what architects call pochés, basically sort of the in-between space between the actual room that you inhabit and then the shell of the building. And of course, in theaters and such, that poché space is used a lot for technical infrastructure, for the fly space of the theaters or stuff like that. You see that a lot also in follies and in technical architecture. On the right is the folly proposed for Louis XIV, right?
Yeah, another elephant.
Yeah, another elephant. Observation deck concealed within an elephant. And then this wonderful piece. This looks like a ruined church. It's along France's Atlantic Wall, but actually it's a military observation tower.
So it was designed this way, at that angle, to make sure that it wasn't bombed by the Nazis.
Yeah, and you see the Trojan horse is very common in China. That's an amazing hotel on the left. It's in Hebei province. And then, yeah, let's have a minute to look at that. It's pretty amazing. And on the right, it's an office building, I guess, which is shaped like an imperial coin. And of course, one of the most famous pieces of architecture history, Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapel, also a replica built in China. Although, of course, it's a lot smaller. I think you can tell by the size of the little bushes in relation to the building.
I think it's actually about half the height of the real building.
Yeah.
So the shrubs on the outside, if you're wondering why those look really large, they're actually tiny shrubs. It's just the building is.
But you know, for architects, this is really a very, I mean, this is like a sacred building. It's an incredibly important work of art. And then actually, sorry, you can just go to the punchline, that before it was demolished, it was used as a steakhouse in China.
So, you know, as we go through a couple of these categories, famous monsters and horror archetypes, of course, zombies is one that we're very preoccupied with at the moment, especially in media, you know, shows like The Walking Dead, which, you know, we personally are glued to. But the idea of buildings that are at least partially dead, and in many cases still occupied, but at least partially in a state of decay. And they linger on, especially if you look at these two images, and these are both from the kind of classic case of massively decayed architecture, at least in the modern era, which is Detroit. The upper left is the old train station, and actually it's an interior view of the same building on the right side. What you see really is that they're kind of preserved in a state, slightly falling apart, still mainly there, but they're used for strange things, like you know, rave events, sometimes parking garages. In Detroit you'll find a theater where they just park on the inside now, and they become open to all kinds of new reuses and kind of strange functions. But a lot of the time, they're just empty. And this ruin occurs, we know, as a result of war, sometimes in extreme cases, or urban change, or just economic cycles. On the left, these two images you see on the left of what's obviously kind of a beachfront. This is in Varosha, which was in Cyprus, which got kind of caught right in the middle of the Civil War. And so it became a kind of a no man's zone between the two, the two occupying powers. And what's interesting about it is it used to be a very famous place for movie stars and the kind of high society to go. And so they had very expensive flats, which were suddenly just empty and evacuated for several decades. They were just left there. And the only people who went in were kind of very intrepid urban explorers who risked being shot to kind of go and take a look around and take photos of these places. And some of them are very grand. Like the upper right was actually one of the greatest of the New York kind of ornamental old world subway stations, which fell into disuse because the line was no longer in use. So it was used for banquets, it was rented out. There were all kinds of really interesting activities, but none of them really involved mass transportation. And it's still there, and it's still in relatively good condition. I guess James Bond fans would know the lower right. This was actually featured in Skyfall. It's Gokonjima Island, which was, I believe, a Mitsubishi production facility, and was at a certain point just shut down. And it was on its own island. So it had enormous numbers, thousands and thousands of inhabitants, restaurants. It had a whole urban microeconomy that was just left there. And suddenly everyone just got on a boat and left. And so it's full of this amazing kind of decaying concrete architecture, which has now become a kind of a small tourist industry. You can actually go and visit it. Sometimes it's just because the architecture kind of becomes obsolete, starts to fall apart. And sometimes it's part of a weird, like a regime. This was one of, the Zairian dictator Mobutu was one of his kind of big public projects, and fell into disrepair when he was kind of ousted from power. And sometimes they're just there. They're very normally part of the normal kind of American landscape. This is a place I used to go because this is where, when I was in college, a long time ago, we used to go to the movies. But now, actually, this mall is 75% unoccupied. There's still a few shops here and there, but as you walk through it, the lights are sort of off in parts of it. Parts of it there's a food court that has 2 or 3 kind of restaurants, and the rest is just kind of falling apart. Rain is coming in from the roof. So it's amazing. It's a mall, and it's still open for business, but in a sense, it's partially ruined already. And this is a very famous example. This just had to do with the kind of administrative delays and the kind of all the craziness of the North Korean regime. But before this was completed in 2013, this hotel stood over Pyongyang just looking like this. It was looming over the entire skyline. If you go to North Korea, you can go and stay there now. But elsewhere, these kind of standard bubble economies that we experience all over the world produce enormous numbers of ruins. Like in the US, this subprime crisis, which we experienced after 2008, filled the American landscape, especially the Midwest, where I'm from, with these abandoned houses. And actually now, the big project is to knock them all down because they become crack houses, they become very, very dangerous places to create risk for the surrounding neighborhoods. So it actually becomes better to destroy them than it is to leave them be. And actually, interestingly, in a lot of places, places in the Midwest, they're becoming farmland again. People are using them to do small-scale urban farming. And the cycles can work the same way when they're very strong. Like this is, what you see here, which looks like a total ruin, is actually a second floor flat on a high street in Bonn. And on the ground floor of this is a very successful shop. It's not actually part of a ruin. But what happened was, because the rent along the high street was so inflated, it was such a successful shopping street, the footprint of the staircase at the ground floor was worth more than the entire second floor. So what the owners did was they removed that staircase, they rented it at a higher rate, and they just abandoned the second floor. So the ground floor has this kind of like lively shops as part of the high street, and the upper floors, and you have entire streets where the second floors have become basically abandoned, just jettisoned. So it was sealed off. And there is this kind of whole tradition of ruin, especially among the Romantics, the people who first actually started talking about horror in architecture. And if you actually do read the book, the introduction is really about the history of the idea of horror in architecture, which, although it sounds surprising, has been around for a long time. It was a very, very important idea in 18th century kind of aesthetic theory. And so a lot of them focused on this building, on Tintern Abbey, which was painted by painters in a kind of melancholy and picturesque way. It's a kind of the great urban ruin. The building on the left is actually, again, it's in China. It looks Italianate. It was a folly that was built and abandoned, but you see that these are the kind of the states of ruin. The right is a famous mill. And often nowadays, due to large-scale ecological devastation, like in South America, we often see cities where entire parts of the city are destroyed by flash floods, potholes, so on. And the rest, it's kind of business as usual. We build bridges across the rivers and keep going.
So this next type of horror genre is frightening size, basically. Giants or even very small miniatures. So what you see here is, on the left, a portrait of a writer, and he was a very small man. So one of the things that George Grosz did was to put him inside a chair so that would convey to you his size relative to the chair. On the right, Herman the Bunny, a bit of a misnomer. He was an award-winning enormous rabbit in Germany.
That's real. That's not a photoshopped image, by the way. It's actually, there's a breed of rabbit, the German giant, and this was the award-winning world prize German giant. And he was almost as, 60% as heavy as his owner at his peak.
So one of the things that this set of photos conveys is that, size is really relative. I mean, it's probably one of the more subtle of the horror types that we talk about, because you need to see it in comparison, direct comparison with something else, maybe of a more normal scale. Strange scales have long been used as a technique of horror and fantasy media for making us feel out of place. So this is a scene from Alien. When they stumble onto the ship, and that's a pilot, right?
So you sort of see on the left, the person on the left is very, very small.
Which turns out really bad.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's hard to see.
Or here, a set for the opera Aida, where it's set against Egyptian ruin. And also, the sense of this use of scale, it's imagined in architecture as a way of evoking really exceptional power. So here, Boulez, this is his proposal for a very large church. You see how small the people are?
That's an interior view, right? The people are like insects.
So scale, is a very unstable element in modern architecture. What you see here, this is the Washington Park Grandstand in Chicago. It's probably one of the first sort of very large buildings in Chicago in the 19th century, right? And what happened here was that you see that modern buildings have suddenly grown much larger than any before. And when this jump in scale happened, there was just no architectural language to account for it. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine, but if you just go back and think, the kinds of buildings that were produced for gatherings of people here were really, they were like country club size. And so this architectural language was used for a lot of the country clubs in the area. And then suddenly there was this grandstand development where they wanted to bring together thousands of people. And the only language that the architects had was still, this country club aesthetic. So what they did here was they just took this medium-sized building and they just made it much bigger. They didn't change any of the proportions. Everything was just inflated like a balloon. And this building would look quite normal if you didn't see the people gathering underneath it. But then, suddenly you realize how, this is when architecture is struggling. How does it express itself when suddenly it needs to be bigger than it knows how to be?
Yeah, maybe because we didn't have the stadium yet, right? So what was happening was that there wasn't any language for this incredibly large size. So the idea was just, well, what happens if we just take what we normally do and we just make every single piece proportionally bigger? That's why it produces something so incredibly strange.
Yeah, so this is at the start when architects were measuring a lot of really big buildings. So this is Otto Koch, the Reichshaus project in Berlin. You just see the series now of really very enormous buildings. Again, this is the Melnikov, his idea for the Ministry of Heavy Industry. And sometimes, the economic pressures on a city also cause this inevitable growth and really stark contrast between buildings of different eras. It's a very familiar scene here. The pinnacle at Duxton juxtaposed against against the fabric directly around it, 3-story shop houses. And it's really that incredible contrast. All the little rooms, all the little apartments up there aggregated to become this enormous building, contrasted with this kind of street front that we're all very accustomed to. And so, the opposite is true. You can also now focus on really small buildings. I mean, as a technique. In Japan especially, we see a lot of this. So Nishizawa's micro-housing in Japan on the upper left. And on the lower right, Atelier Bauhaus, the Tread Machia house, which takes the same kind of form of its neighboring buildings, but instead of being many rooms inside that, it's really just kind of a single room house.
I believe that house is actually 350 square feet.
Yeah.
How come we have so many funny China slides?
Yeah.
This is not really intentional, sorry. But this is the window on the World Amusement Park in Shenzhen, which is really fun because everything is miniaturized and it basically gives you really a tour of the world in 25 minutes. This was before Legoland, and basically everything is at a different scale. So there's this kind of wild, radical rescaling of things that are familiar. And what's amazing, it's a very compact place. So actually they're all placed very close to each other. So you will get Mount Rushmore right next to the U.S. Capitol. And then what's funny always with these pictures is you have to look at the size of the shrubs. The shrubs there are like the size of the bottom 2 stories of the U.S. Capitol building. So that's a kind of a small overview of some of the subjects we talk about in the book, but just to entice you, there's more. So there are other subjects that we look at, for example. We won't go into any depth, but of course distortion is a huge element of the horror genre. For example, like in the right, natural distortions of old buildings, but also nowadays a very self-conscious architectural strategy to distort buildings for entertainment purposes, or to try out the possibilities of distorted form. So like again, MBRDV in the lower left, where they take all of the floor plates of the building and they warp them into a continuous surface, so you climb the building almost like you would climb the side of a hill. Or in the more kind of crazy sense, the upper right, this is, I don't know how many of you like cartoons, this Tex Avery did a lot of the great kind of classic American cartoons, but reminded us a lot of this building in Poland in the lower left, and that's not photoshopped, it actually looks like that. The idea is really to kind of create a bizarre and attractive retail feature, but also it's quite clever because where it bulges out is actually kind of the front door, so it's kind of inviting you in. It's an interesting kind of a feature that people go and visit just to see it, but as a shopping project it turned out pretty successful in spite of how gross it actually is. We look at solidity, at areas of especially kinds of architecture where it's uncomfortably solid. Buildings that are carved out of hillsides and are cave-like. They're not like conventional architecture as we know it. For example, at Cappadocia, in this town in Spain where the whole town was built really literally under the eave of this enormous rock outcropping, so that when you walk through the street at some point and you look up, you don't see the sky, you just see kind of the underside of a mountain. Again, a sort of Cappadocia experience. And generally these kind of buildings where they're much more about the experience of being inside something impossibly large and deep and massive, kind of almost like a Lord of the Rings type, inner mountain experience. And then another interesting subject, hybrids of human beings and nature. So cases where people become uncomfortably across the boundary with animals, with plants, with vegetable matter, and these kinds of things. Like for example here, this is an actual newspaper warning, by the way, that told people not to take a certain patent medicine because it would actually kind of turn you into a salad. But it is an architectural strategy, like Bernard Maybeck, for example, in California, who tactically overgrew a lot of his buildings. We see this still very much in LA architecture today when we drive around the city. And again, as a strategy, the left side, maybe you guys are familiar with, is Newton Suites, close to Newton Circus. The upper left is Emilio Ambas, who did a building which was just imagined as very much a green mountainside. And increasingly, buildings today that take advantage of those kinds of green strategies to kind of push architecture over the line into the realm of the natural. So that's a little overview of our book. We're here if you have any kind of questions or would like to discuss it further. Please do.
Is your term horror to be taken in a very literal sense, that it evokes fear and trepidation in the buildings that we see?
It does. It does and it doesn't. It's definitely part of a history where we see architects trying to create buildings that would create a sense of emotion. Shock people, move them past a sense of purely aesthetic appreciation, where they would say something is beautiful or something is ugly. And we do see in the book a lot of buildings that I think, to a layperson, if you go and just visit it, are actually quite shocking. And the idea with a lot of them, some of them are, this occurs by accident. In some cases, it is a very self-conscious strategy. The architects are really trying to produce a sense of shock to show the way in which their buildings are kind of moving away from what people would expect, away from historical conventions.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
In many cases, I think it can result simply in buildings that are there for shock value, for entertainment value, like this crooked house, which we just saw a moment ago. But I think in many cases, what it does architecturally is really show the way in which the experience of a place, of an environment, could be different from what we expect. So in our sense, especially when we talk about this in the introduction, we do see a lot of value in the spirit of the architects that produce these horrible buildings, because what they do is try and push architecture past a kind of point of comfort, kind of create a zone in which people occupy and think about their environment in a way that they probably wouldn't do if the work was more comfortable.
I have a question. How much do cinema, paintings, and literature influence your own architectural practice? Because your book draws a lot from all this.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that that we necessarily talk about that all the time as a point of departure, a point of sort of inspiration. We are really very much interested, though, in experience and emotion. So what Josh was talking about earlier in answering, how does horror, or rather, how does sort of deviation from the norm, how does that sort of elevate, your experience somewhere? We do sort of talk about that. But we're also really interested in form, in how the language of buildings. And it's really for that reason that we found we needed to find an analog, another way of talking about it. Because a lot of people in our office, I mean, they come from different education backgrounds, right? So in order to communicate the kinds of things that we're interested in, we want to be able to refer to other things that are intuitive and that make sense to them. So we do talk about horror, like monsters. I mean, we're not joking, we really do talk about that. Or talk about, burgers or, club sandwiches, to kind of describe the kinds of themes that we're interested in, the kind of expression we're interested in.
Because I guess going back to what Shane spoke about a little bit at the beginning, was just that we've always found it more interesting or more accessible to talk to people about architecture by referring and comparing architecture to other kinds of things. Food is the other thing. We always talk about food in architecture. We talk about architecture compared to animals or cars, or whatever. Because when you speak by means of analogy, then people suddenly have a touchstone. They have some. You're referring to something that they can speak about, and it moves it away from that kind of closed world of architectural jargon, which we feel we feel that architects could do a lot better in terms of communicating their intentions and their goals to a wider public.
When you yourself draw the buildings, do you think of an allusion to this painting, this work of literature?
Yeah, but among other things, right? So sometimes, they will suddenly be talking about the Little Prince. For some reason, the Little Prince comes up here. So, as your kind of life changes, like when we had 2 young kids, we found that like children's books became a huge reference. So now a lot of the time when we do talk about design, these things do come up. But we very rarely talk about design as an autonomous thing. That is, we don't just talk about design operations or design language within purely its own language. We almost always refer to outside things.
Following up on this question, for instance, would you think that architects now, because in urban cities, they're building bigger and bigger buildings, taller and taller buildings, do you think that they have an image of Godzilla in their head when they do those things?
No, probably not. Although I do know a lot of architects who are really into like Japanese manga.
They probably have a toy on their computer. Right?
No, I tell you how many people I know, architects who prefer to movies like Akira, especially the kind of Japanese cyberpunk media, especially, and a lot of apocalyptic stuff too. So you may be right about that actually. I think, I do think that there's a problem, especially with size, especially with conceptualizing buildings as they become very huge. Like, we spent years talking about this building, trying to understand this particular building, because in a way it is very much like an entire urban,
this building here,
this
right
building
now,
we're in right now.
Neon City,
Neon
right?
City.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's a place where you travel every 10 feet, every 15 feet. It's a different experiential environment. The whole world is divided into a series of miniatures that you experience that are isolated from one another. When you go to the outside, it's just kind of a very funny, neutral box. It's very inarticulate.
When I first saw this, and I'm an architect, when I first saw this, I thought it was an enlarged Chinese school. It looked like one.
Yeah. So there's that crisis, right? And again, that gets a little bit to the Trojan horse problem. It's like, with a very big building, how do you even express the outside? Like, what is it? And what's interesting that we've seen when we started to look back at problems of size was all of these knots that architects tied themselves up in, all these experiments that they made, trying to find a language for something that was outside of the scale of architecture to date.
Now, what about this idea of part of architecture, place setting and everything has to do with something that comes first, like for instance Dracula's castle, Frankenstein's hideout, the Ghostbusters building, so which comes first, then you see a castle and you think it's haunted. So there's a horror, an element of horror in there. It becomes imposing, it becomes spooky. Is that part of your book? Do you look into that?
There is an interesting give and take, which is something we talk about in the introduction of it. We're very interested in the period, the Romantics, right? They're the ones who really start talking about horror as an idea aesthetically, and they start writing the first horror novels, right? Like Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, these guys, right? So what's interesting is a lot of those really express this paranoia about technology, social change, new urbanization, a lot of these kinds of social phenomena that were happening at the time. But what's really interesting is then they visualize them, they place them into these Gothic castles, laboratories inside the Gothic castles and so on. And I think in a way though that becomes part of the whole fantasy of modern architecture. Architects become very aware of those kinds of media, and they start to feed into our image of what like a new kind of technological modernity would be like both as a good thing and also as a horror, as a really scary thing. So I think that there's that really kind of fascinating cyclical process where we're forced as architects to generate this kind of newness. People absorb it in a kind of a literary or imaginative way, and then we take it back. So it's this kind of like give and take, I think, that happens in the process.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was just wondering, how do architects reconcile the artistic part with the functional part of architecture?
Oh my gosh.
That is the question.
I don't think we can answer that.
Yeah, I think you have to ask somebody who's like a much more senior architect. In the sense that, I mean, it's a constant problem, and we're always trying to reconcile it. I think that what we see again as it relates to this project is exactly what we were just discussing, which is that architects are faced with these technical problems very often, which are produced by history. They're produced by markets, economies. We don't necessarily know how to digest them because we move a lot slower. Architects seem like they're very at the forefront. Actually, often we're kind of catching up with problems. And so a lot of the work you see of the most brilliant architects is trying to kind of take very, very big historical changes to buildings and digest them. So that's why, Kohlhaas, for example, wrote this essay on bigness, which is just what we were talking about. How do you take a very big building and subject it to the rules of conventional architecture? His answer was, you can't. It's something completely new. You have to reinvent form, and you have to let certain things go, and you have to move your emphasis over. So I think a lot of what happens with this process is we trail behind it, and then we kind of look at what each other are doing, and we try and find ways where these things which would otherwise be impossible can be domesticated back again and made into a new architectural language. And I think that's why we constantly see buildings changing. Even if we wanted to keep them the same, we actually can't force them.
Do you have pictures of your own buildings that you can explain to us how you conceptualize?
For ourselves?
Yeah. Your buildings, do you have them?
We can invite you to our office.
Yeah, you can come and take a look. We actually don't. We for this book project, we actually have kept our own work kind of out of it.
Oh.
Not because we don't think we produce horrifying architecture at times, but just because we wanted to focus on the work of other architects.
Just reading, I read your book previously. I've seen a lot of Singaporean references to buildings. Then I'm just thinking that maybe you can comment something on the horror in relation to Singapore urban landscape or the Singapore architectural landscape, and how relevant it is to Singapore.
This book started out as a guidebook to Singapore 5 years ago. And in part not because we felt that there were more buildings that would fall into a horror category here than anywhere else, but this is where we live. So this is every day. We drive around, we talk about buildings in the car, and then we so the project really kind of incubated in a Singapore context. So what's funny is I have the beta version of this book, which is just all Singapore books, and it was kind of like it was a guide, because we did see some of the same forces. For example, a lot of pressure of real estate, urban real estate. If you think about it, especially coming from outside of Singapore, coming from somewhere like the US where there's so much real estate and land is relatively speaking very cheap, it seems amazing to me that anyone buys a bungalow for $25 million. It's inconceivable. So what we started to look at in particular were the pressures of making things on a very small footprint, like this kind of convulsive pressure you have in Singapore where you do get open space, and then what you get is massive conglomerations, like either in shopping centers or in buildings like we saw with the Pinnacle. I think the Pinnacle is a scale that in the US, people wouldn't really be able to process it. Outside of a few very dense urban areas, it's a very, very futuristic Asian field. So I think we see pressures that do push buildings in this direction.
Yeah, and in very extreme, like that Jalan Haji Alias house, where you see, usually in most cities in the world, you will see semi-Ds. They look the same for most of their lives, or terrace housing. But here, there's just each semi-detached house is worth so much, that you put all your money into it and you do it up. And the amount of sort of construction, the amount of effort that goes into that one little house is so extreme, that you end up with that kind of disjunction between the two sides if one hasn't renovated yet. Yeah.
So even if you share a party wall, you exist in splendid isolation.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We had a series of amazing photos of the biggest party walls that we could find. We went around all the semi-D districts, and what's interesting is in the European ones, the party wall is always concealed within the house, because the idea was always you were pretending to live in a bigger house, which you share with your neighbor, right? Whereas here often you see this huge, almost like a Hollywood backdrop, where there's the wall, and then the houses kind of live on either side, and they maximally differentiate each other.
Right. Is it difficult to take this theoretical perspective from the architecture? Is it very located in a Singaporean perspective? So it's very difficult to apply to American landscapes, etc.
I think it's, different parts of it would be much stronger in different places. And as we thought about generalizing the study, we brought in a lot of things where suddenly they were less applicable to Singapore landscapes, just because they came from either different
like
cultural traditions.
dead.
Yeah, partially dead. Like we really don't find a lot of decay and unused spaces in Singapore. Like the examples that we looked at here were more like hotels that would decant rooms to kind of maximize GFA, but it's a very different problem. So I think there are definitely forces which are global, which are shared by everyone, where you could look at certain categories that would be common all over the place. And then other ones that really are much more either distributed around the world in different pockets or very different wherever they appear. So sometimes we see the same force, but like real estate value, but it produces very different kinds of things. Like in the US it's more about contrast, whereas in Singapore it's really about building everything up everywhere.
Conversely, are there enough nice things in Singapore for an spoke to be beauty in architecture?
I think so.
Oh, but we don't mean horror in a negative way. We have to be clear about that.
Actually, no, but
we
to be honest,
don't.
this book collects most of our favorite books of architecture. It's really more about the radicalism of their proposition. It's not that we look at them and go, ugh. It's that we look at them and go, wow.
Unconventional.
That's
actually, I think some of them are amazing.
I mean, these are buildings that blow our minds, and because the thing about the buildings that fall in the horror genre to us is that they're very articulate about what they're trying to do. They really put an idea out in a very strong way. And so for us, that's like, if we did a little manifesto of the stuff that kind of pushes us along when we look at it, it's actually these buildings. But I mean, sorry, I'll bring in Darren, but we were, Melanie's husband is Darren, so as the photographer who took the picture of ducks.
Pinnacle.
Yeah, Pinnacle. And a lot of other amazing photos. You should go and check out his photos if you don't know his work. It's amazing. But our little circle of Facebook friends is all about just cataloging pictures of Singapore buildings that we love. And what's funny is that they're all the buildings that are now starting to get destroyed. So getting destroyed.
Oh.
Queenstown Bowl is now being destroyed, but also all of the kind of brutalist era architecture, which we felt was really, really powerful, and unfortunately is not conserved.
Right.
I have another question.
Oh, I thought you were coming to say that.